An audiobook of The State and Revolution by V.I. Lenin. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this is an audiobook of The State and Revolution, the Marxist Theory of the State, and the Tasks of the Proletariat in the Revolution by V.I. Lenin. It was originally written from August to September 1917. The source is Collected Works, Volume 25. First published in 1918, HTML transcription by Zodiac and Brian Baggins. The online version is from the Lenin Internet Archive at Marxists.org, 1993-1999. And thanks as usual to Marxists.org, the Marxists Internet Archive, for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So the only note before we get into the text itself from Socialism for All is that this is the 7th entry in the Marxism-Leninism Basic Study Plan curriculum from the Anti-Imperialism Movement, or Movimiento Antiimperialista, MAI. We have a playlist going on the channel. If you go to the Playlists tab on the channel, you will find that playlist and many others of videos that we have put together on socialism. The preceding entry in this playlist is Lenin's What Is to Be Done. The next entry that we'll be putting up from this playlist is Lenin's The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, coming soon to the channel. Okay, that's the end of notes from S4A, so let's get into the text. The text starts with a note from the Lenin Internet Archive. Lenin wrote The State and Revolution in August and September 1917, when he was in hiding from persecution of the provisional government. The need for such a theoretical work as this was mentioned by Lenin in the second half of 1916. It was then that he wrote his note on the Youth International, in which he criticized Bukharin's position on the question of the state and promised to write a detailed article on what he thought to be the Marxist attitude to the state. In a letter to A.M. Kollontai on February 17, 1917, he said that he had almost got ready material on that question. This material was written in a small blue-covered notebook headed Marxism on the State. In it, Lenin had collected quotations from the works of Marx and Engels and extracts from the books by Kautsky, Pannekoek, and Bernstein with his own critical notes, conclusions, and generalizations. When Lenin left Switzerland for Russia in April 1917, he feared arrest by the provisional government and left the manuscript of Marxism on the State behind, as it would have been destroyed had he been caught. When in hiding after the July events, Lenin wrote in a note, quote, "Entre nous, if I am knocked off, I ask you to publish my notebook, Marxism on the State. It got held up in Stockholm. It is bound in a blue cover. All the quotations from Marx and Engels are collected there, also those from Kautsky against Pannekoek. There are a number of remarks, notes, and formulas. I think a week's work would be enough to publish it. I consider it important because not only Plekhanov, but Kautsky too, is confused." Unquote. When Lenin received his notebook from Stockholm, he used the material he had collected as a basis for his book, The State and Revolution. According to Lenin's plan, The State and Revolution was to have consisted of 7 chapters, but he did not write the 7th. The experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and only a detailed plan has remained. In a note to the publisher, Lenin wrote that if he, quote, was too slow in completing this, the 7th chapter, or should it turn out to be too bulky, the first 6 chapters should be published separately as Book 1. Originally, the name F.F. Ivanovsky is shown on the first page of the notebook manuscript as that of the author. Lenin intended to publish the book under that pseudonym, otherwise the provisional government would have confiscated it for his name alone. The book, however, was not printed until 1918, when there was no longer any need for the pseudonym. The second edition appeared in 1919. In this revision, Lenin added to Chapter 2 a new section, the presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. That's the end of that section. Just to comment quickly on the timeline here. So of course the October Revolution in 1917 is when the Bolsheviks took power. That's why Lenin no longer needed to use a pseudonym. And the provisional government from which he was hiding was the government that was established by the Russian bourgeoisie after the Tsar was deposed in the February Revolution in 1917. So it was during this eventful year that Lenin wrote this work, and well, quite a lot happened. Okay, on to the preface to the first edition. The question of the state is now acquiring particular importance both in theory and in practical politics. The imperialist war has immensely accelerated and intensified the process of transformation of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism. The monstrous oppression of the working people by the state, which is merging more and more with the all-powerful capitalist associations, is becoming increasingly monstrous. The advanced countries, we mean their hinterland, are becoming military convict prisons for the workers. The unprecedented horrors and miseries of the protracted war are making the people's position unbearable and increasing their anger. The world proletarian revolution is clearly maturing. The question of its relation to the state is acquiring practical importance. The elements of opportunism that accumulated over the decades of comparatively peaceful development have given rise to the trend of social chauvinism, which dominated the official socialist parties throughout the world. This trend, socialism in words and chauvinism in deeds, Plekhanov, Patrusov, Breshkovskaya, Rubanovich, and in a slightly veiled form, Tseretelli, Chernov and Co. in Russia, Scheiderman, Lejeune, David, and others in Germany, Renaudel, Gesda, and Vandervelde in France and Belgium, Hindman and the Fabians in England, etc., etc., is conspicuous for the base, servile adaptation of the, quote, leaders of socialism to the interests not only of their national bourgeoisie, but of their state, for the majority of the so-called great powers have long been exploiting and enslaving a whole number of small and weak nations. And the imperialist war is a war for the division and redivision of this kind of booty. The struggle to free the working people from the influence of the bourgeoisie in general, and of the imperialist bourgeoisie in particular, is impossible without a struggle against opportunist prejudices concerning the state. First of all, we examine the theory of Marx and Engels of the state, and dwell in particular detail on those aspects of this theory which are ignored or have been distorted by the opportunists. Then we deal specially with the one who is chiefly responsible for these distortions, Karl Kautsky, the best-known leader of the Second International, 1889 to 1914, which has met with such miserable bankruptcy in the present war. Lastly, we sum up the main results of the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905, and particularly of 1917. Apparently, the latter is now, early August 1917, completing the first stage of its development. But this revolution as a whole can only be understood as a link in a chain of socialist proletarian revolutions being caused by the imperialist war. The question of the relation of the socialist proletarian revolution to the state, therefore, is acquiring not only practical political importance, but also the significance of a most urgent problem of the day, the problem of explaining to the masses what they will have to do before long to free themselves from capitalist tyranny. The author, August 1917. That's the end of the preface to the first edition, now beginning the preface to the second edition. The present second edition is published virtually unaltered, except that section 3 has been added to chapter 2. Signed, the author, Moscow, December 17, 1918. And that's the end of that preface. Moving on now to chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. Section 1. The State, a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. What is now happening to Marx's theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names, to a certain extent, for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now, quote, Marxists, don't laugh. And more frequently, German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the, quote, national German Marx, who they claim educated the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. In these circumstances, in view of the unprecedentedly widespread distortion of Marxism, our prime task is to reestablish what Marx really taught on the subject of the state. This will necessitate a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, long quotations will render the text cumbersome and not help at all to make it popular reading, but we cannot possibly dispense with them. All, or at any rate, all the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must by all means be quoted as fully as possible, so that the reader may form an independent opinion of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism, and of the evolution of those views, and so that their distortion by the Kautskyism now prevailing may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Let us begin with the most popular of Engels' works, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, the 6th edition of which was published in Stuttgart as far back as 1894. We have to translate the quotations from the German originals, as the Russian translations, while very numerous, are for the most part either incomplete or very unsatisfactory. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, quote, "The state is, therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without. Just as little is it the reality of the ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it is split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power, seemingly standing above society, that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order, and this power, arisen out of society but placing itself above it, and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state," unquote. This expresses with perfect clarity the basic idea of Marxism with regard to the historical role and the meaning of the state. The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. It is on this most important and fundamental point that the distortion of Marxism, proceeding along two main lines, begins. On the one hand, the bourgeois, and particularly the petty bourgeois, ideologists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, quote, correct Marx, in such a way as to make it appear that the state is an organ for the reconciliation of classes. According to Marx, the state could neither have arisen nor maintained itself had it been possible to reconcile classes. From what the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists say, with quite frequent and benevolent references to Marx, it appears that the state does reconcile classes. According to Marx, The state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of, quote, order, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, order means the reconciliation of classes, and not the oppression of one class by another. To alleviate the conflict means reconciling classes and not depriving the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of struggle to overthrow their oppressors. For instance, when in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the significance and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action, and, moreover, action on a mass scale, all the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks descended at once to the petty bourgeois theory that the, quote, state, quote, reconciles classes. Comment, social revolutionaries and Mensheviks are basically what we would call radlibs and sockdems today. Continuing, innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly saturated with this petty bourgeois and Philistine reconciliation theory, that the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, the class opposite to it, is something the petty bourgeois Democrats will never be able to understand. Their attitude to the state is one of the most striking manifestations of the fact that our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, a point that we Bolsheviks have always maintained, but petty bourgeois Democrats using near-socialist phraseology. Comment, that's exactly, so what I always say radlibs are liberals using radical language. That's exactly it right there. Continuing. On the other hand, the Kautskyite distortion of Marxism is far more subtle. Quote, theoretically, it is not denied that the state is an organ of class rule, or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. But what is overlooked or glossed over is this: if the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and, quote, alienating itself more and more from it, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power, which was created by the ruling class, and which is the embodiment of this, quote, alienation. As we shall see later, Marx very explicitly drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion on the strength of a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of the revolution. And, as we shall show in detail further on, it is this conclusion which Kautsky has, quote, forgotten and distorted. Section 2. Special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc. Engels continues, quote, as distinct from the old Gentile, tribal or clan order, the state first divides its subjects according to territory, unquote. This division seems natural to us, but it costs a prolonged struggle against the old organization, according to generations or tribes. Quote, the second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power, which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds, of which Gentile, clan society knew nothing, unquote. Engels elucidates the concept of the power which is called the state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc. at their command. We are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men because the public power, which is an attribute of every state, quote, does not directly coincide with the armed population, with its, quote, self-acting armed organization. Like all great revolutionary thinkers, Engels tries to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to what prevailing Philistinism regards as least worthy of attention, as the most habitual thing, hallowed by prejudices that are not only deep-rooted, but one might say petrified. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. But how can it be otherwise? From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans at the end of the 19th century, whom Engels was addressing, and who had not gone through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not have been otherwise. They could not understand at all what a, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population was. When asked why it became necessary to have special bodies of armed men placed above society and alienating themselves from it, police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to utter a few phrases borrowed from Spencer of Mikhailovsky to refer to the growing complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so on. Such a reference seems scientific and effectively lulls the ordinary person to sleep by obscuring the important and basic fact, namely the split of society into irreconcilable antagonistic classes. Were it not for this split, the, quote, self-acting armed organization of the population would differ from the primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys, or of primitive men, or of men united in clans by its complexity, its high technical level, and so on. But such an organization would still be possible. It is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and, moreover, irreconcilably antagonistic classes whose self-acting arming would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters. In the above argument, Engels raises theoretically the very same question which every great revolution raises before us in practice, palpably, and, what is more, on a scale of mass action, namely, the question of the relationship between special bodies of armed men and the self-acting armed organization of the population. We shall see how this question is specifically illustrated by the experience of the European and Russian revolutions. But to return to Engels' exposition, he points out that sometimes, in certain parts of North America, for example, this public power is weak. He has in mind a rare exception in capitalist society, and those parts of North America in its pre-imperialist days where the free colonists predominated, but that, generally speaking, it grows stronger. Quote, it, the public power, grows stronger, however, in proportion as class antagonisms within the state become more acute, and as adjacent states become larger and more populous. We have only to look at our present-day Europe, where class struggle and rivalry in conquest have tuned up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to swallow the whole of society and even the state, unquote. This was written not later than the early 90s of the last century, Engels' last preface being dated June 16, 1891. The turn toward imperialism, meaning the complete domination of the trusts, the omnipotence of the big banks, a grand-scale colonial policy, and so forth, was only just beginning in France, and was even weaker in North America and in Germany. Since then, rivalry in conquest has taken a gigantic stride, all the more because by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the world had been completely divided up among these rivals in conquest, i.e., among the predatory great powers. Since then, military and naval armaments have grown fantastically, and the predatory war of 1914 to 17 for the domination of the world by Britain or Germany, for the division of the spoils, has brought the swallowing of all forces of society by the rapacious state power close to complete catastrophe. Engels could, as early as 1891, point to rivalry in conquest as one of the most important distinguishing features of the foreign policy of the great powers, While the social chauvinist scoundrels have, ever since 1914, when this rivalry, many times intensified, gave rise to an imperialist war, been covering up the defense of the predatory interests of, quote, their own bourgeoisie, with phrases about, quote, defense of the fatherland, defense of the republic and the revolution, etc. Section 3. The state, an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class. The maintenance of the special public power standing above society requires taxes and state loans. Quote, having public power and the right to levy taxes, Engels writes, the officials now stand as organs of society above society. The free, voluntary respect that was accorded to the organs of the Gentile clan constitution does not satisfy them, even if they could gain it. Special laws are enacted proclaiming the sanctity and immunity of the officials. The shabbiest police servant has more authority than the representative of the clan, but even the head of the military power of a civilized state may well envy the elder of a clan the unrestrained respect of society, unquote. The question of the privileged position of the officials as organs of state power is raised here. The main point indicated is, what is it that places them above society? We shall see how this theoretical question was answered in practice by the Paris Commune in 1871, and how it was obscured from a reactionary standpoint by Kautsky in 1912. Quote, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. The ancient and feudal states were organs for the exploitations of the slaves and serfs. Likewise, the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exception, however, periods occur in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly that the state power as ostensible mediator acquires for the moment a certain degree of independence of both. Such were the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Bonapartism of the First and Second Empires in France, and the Bismarck regime in Germany, unquote. Such, we may add, is the Kerensky government in Republican Russia, since it began to persecute the revolutionary proletariat at a moment when, owing to the leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats, the Soviets have already become impotent, while the bourgeoisie are not yet strong enough simply to disperse them. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, quote, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. First, by means of the, quote, direct corruption of officials, America. Secondly, by means of an, quote, alliance of the government and the stock exchange, France and America. At present, imperialism and the domination of the banks have, quote, developed into an exceptional art, both these methods of upholding and giving effect to the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions. Since, for instance, in the very first months of the Russian Democratic Republic, one might say during the honeymoon of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, joined in wedlock to the bourgeoisie in the coalition government. Quick comment, if you'd like to know more about this, I recently, in April 2021, posted a series of 3 texts by Lenin concerning basically the events of the 2 revolutions, the February Revolution and the October Revolution in 1917. Their titles are War and Revolution, Lessons of the Revolution, and The Crisis Has Matured. There's also a Stalin text, October Revolution and the Tactics of the Russian Communists, posted soon thereafter. And in these texts, you can get a pretty good idea of the treachery of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, who basically, although those 2 groups, not the Bolsheviks, dominated the Soviets, they refused in a revolutionary moment to take power, instead basically just joining with the bourgeoisie. Continuing. Mr. Palczynski obstructed every measure intended for curbing the capitalists and their marauding practices. their plundering of the state by means of war contracts, and since later on Mr. Palczynski, upon resigning from the cabinet and being, of course, replaced by another quite similar Palczynski, was rewarded by the capitalists with a lucrative job with a salary of 120,000 rubles per annum. What would you call that? Direct or indirect bribery? An alliance of the government and the syndicates, or merely friendly relations? What role do the Chernovs, Tseretellis, Avksentyevs, and Skobalevs play? Are they the direct or only the indirect allies of the millionaire treasury looters? Another reason why the omnipotence of wealth is more certain in a democratic republic is that it does not depend on defects in the political machinery or on the faulty political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell, through the Palczynskis, Chernovs, Tseretellis, and co., it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of persons, institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it. Comment sound familiar? We must also note that Engels is most explicit in calling universal suffrage as well an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, obviously taking account of the long experience of German social democracy, is, quote, the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present-day state, unquote. The petty bourgeois Democrats, such as our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, and also their twin brothers, all the social chauvinists and opportunists of Western Europe, expect just this more from universal suffrage. They themselves share and instill into the minds of the people the false notion that universal suffrage in the present-day state is really capable of revealing the will of the majority of the working people and of securing its realization. Here, we can only indicate this false notion, only point out that Engels' perfectly clear statement is distorted at every step in the propaganda and agitation of the official, i.e. opportunist, socialist parties. A detailed exposure of the utter falsity of this notion, which Engels brushes aside here, is given in our further account of the views of Marx and Engels on the present-day state. Engels gives a general summary of his views in the most popular of his works in the following words, quote, "The state, then, has not existed from all eternity. There have been some societies that did without it, that had no idea of the state and state power. At a certain stage of economic development, which was necessarily bound up with the split of society into classes, the state became a necessity owing to this split. We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as they rose at an earlier stage. Along with them, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers, will put the whole machinery of the state where it will then belong, into a museum of antiquities, by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe," unquote. We do not often come across this passage in the propaganda and agitation literature of the present-day Social Democrats. Even when we do come across it, it is mostly quoted in the same manner as one bows before an icon, i.e., it is done to show official respect for Engels, but no attempt is made to gauge the breadth and depth of the revolution that this relegating of, quote, the whole machinery of state to a museum of antiquities implies. In most cases, we do not even find an understanding of what Engels calls the state machine. Section 4. The withering away of the state and violent revolution. Engels' words regarding the, quote, withering away of the state are so widely known they are often quoted, and so clearly reveal the essence of the customary adaptation of Marxism to opportunism that we must deal with them in detail. We shall quote the whole argument from which they are taken. Quote, "The proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with, but thereby it abolishes itself as the proletariat. abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, operating amid class antagonisms, needed the state, that is, an organization of the particular exploiting class, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production: slavery, serfdom or bondage, wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented, for its own time, society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens; in the Middle Ages, of the feudal nobility; in our own time, of the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon the present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from this struggle, are removed, nothing more remains to be held in subjection, nothing necessitating a special coercive force, a state. The first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase "a free people's state," both to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the so-called anarchists' demand that the state be abolished overnight. Unquote. That was quoting from Anti-Düring. It is safe to say that of this argument of Engels, which is so remarkably rich in ideas, only one point has become an integral part of socialist thought among modern socialist parties, namely that, according to Marx, the state withers away, as distinct from the anarchist doctrine of the abolition of the state. To prune Marxism to such an extent means reducing it to opportunism, for this interpretation only leaves a vague notion of a slow, even gradual change, of absence of leaps and storms, of absence of revolution. The current, widespread, popular, if one may say so, conception of the withering away of the state undoubtedly means obscuring, if not repudiating, revolution. Such an interpretation, however, is the crudest distortion of Marxism, advantageous only to the bourgeoisie. In point of theory, it is based on disregard for the most important circumstances and considerations indicated in, say, Engels' summary argument we have just quoted in full. In the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that, in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. It is not done to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or is considered to be something in the nature of, quote, Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. As a matter of fact, however, these words briefly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in its proper place. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletarian revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but is abolished by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state or semi-state. Secondly, the state is a special coercive force. Engels gives this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost lucidity, and from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely what is meant by abolition of the state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. And it is self-evident that such a replacement of one bourgeois special force by another proletarian special force cannot possibly take place in the form of withering away. Thirdly, in speaking of the state withering away, and the even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society. That is, after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy, but it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamelessly distort Marxism, that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself, or withering away. This seems very strange at first sight, but it is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state. The state in general, i.e. the most complete democracy, can only wither away. Fourthly, after formulating his famous proposition that the state withers away, Engels at once explains specifically that this proposition is directed against both the opportunists and the anarchists. In doing this, Engels puts in the forefront that conclusion drawn from the proposition that the state withers away, which is directed against the opportunists. One can wager that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware or do not remember that Engels directed his conclusions from that proposition not against anarchists alone, and of the remaining 10, probably 9 do not know the meaning of a free people's state, or why an attack on this slogan means an attack on opportunists. This is how history is written. This is how a great revolutionary teaching is imperceptibly falsified and adapted to prevailing Philistinism. The conclusion directed against the anarchists has been repeated thousands of times. It has been vulgarized and rammed into people's heads in the shallowest form, and has acquired the strength of a prejudice, whereas the conclusion directed against the opportunists has been obscured and forgotten. The Free People's State was a program demand and a catchword current among the German Social Democrats in the 1870s. This catchword is devoid of all political content, except that it describes the concept of democracy in a pompous Philistine fashion, insofar as it hinted in a legally permissible manner at a democratic republic. Engels was prepared to, quote, justify its use, quote, for a time, from an agitational point of view. But it was an opportunist catchword, for it amounted to something more than prettifying bourgeois democracy, and was also failure to understand the socialist criticism of the state in general. We are in favor of a democratic republic as the best form of state for the proletariat under capitalism, but we have no right to forget that wage slavery is the lot of the people, even in the most democratic bourgeois republic. Furthermore, every state is a, quote, special force for the suppression of the oppressed class. Consequently, every state is not free and not a people's state. Marx and Engels explained this repeatedly to their party comrades in the 70s. Fifthly, the same work of Engels, whose arguments about the withering away of the state everyone remembers, also contains an argument of the significance of violent revolution. Engels' historical analysis of its role becomes a veritable panegyric on violent revolution. This, quote, no one remembers. It is not done in modern socialist parties to talk or even think about the significance of this idea, and it plays no part whatsoever in their daily propaganda and agitation among the people. And yet, It is inseparably bound up with the withering away of the state into one harmonious whole. Here is Engels' argument. Quote, that force, however, plays yet another role, other than that of a diabolical power. In history, a revolutionary role, that, in the words of Marx, it is the midwife of every old society, which is pregnant with a new one, that it is the instrument with which social movement forces its way through and shatters the dead, fossilized political forms. Of this, there is not a word in Herr Düring. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of an economy based on exploitation. Unfortunately, because all use of force demoralizes, he says, the person who uses it. And this in Germany, where a violent collision, which may after all be forced on the people, would at least have the advantage of wiping out the servility which has penetrated the nation's mentality following the humiliation of the 30 Years' War. And this person's mode of thought, dull, insipid, and impotent, presumes to impose itself on the most revolutionary party that history has ever known, unquote. How can this panegyric on violent revolution, which Engels insistently brought to the attention of the German Social Democrats between 1878 and 1894, i.e. right up to the time of his death, be combined with the theory of the withering away of the state to form a single theory? Usually the two are combined by means of eclecticism, by an unprincipled or sophistic selection made arbitrarily, or to please the powers that be, of first one, then another argument, and in 99 cases out of 100, if not more, it is the idea of the withering away that is placed in the forefront. Dialectics are replaced by eclecticism. This is the most usual, most widespread practice to be met with in present-day official social democratic literature in relation to Marxism. This sort of substitution is of course nothing new. It was observed even in the history of classical Greek philosophy. In falsifying Marxism in opportunist fashion, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics is the easiest way of deceiving the people. It gives an illusory satisfaction. It seems to take into account all sides of the process, all trends of development, all the conflicting influences, and so forth, whereas in reality, it provides no integral and revolutionary conception of the process of social development at all. We have already said above, and shall show more fully later, that the theory of Marx and Engels of the inevitability of a violent revolution refers to the bourgeois state. The latter cannot be superseded by the proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the process of withering away, but as a general rule, only through a violent revolution. The panegyric Engels sang in its honor, and which fully corresponds to Marx's repeated statements, see the concluding passages of The Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto, with their proud and open proclamation of the inevitability of a violent revolution. See what Marx wrote nearly 30 years later, in criticizing the Gotha program of 1875, when he mercilessly castigated the opportunist character of that program. This panegyric is by no means a mere impulse, a mere declamation, or a polemical sally. The necessity of systematically imbuing the masses with this, and precisely this view of violent revolution, lies at the root of the entire theory of Marx and Engels. The betrayal of their theory by the now prevailing social chauvinist and Kautskyite trends expresses itself strikingly in both these trends, ignoring such propaganda and agitation. The supersession of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. The abolition of the proletarian state, i.e., of the state in general, is impossible except through the process of withering away. A detailed and concrete elaboration of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each particular revolutionary situation, when they analyzed the lessons of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now pass to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their theory. That's the end of chapter 1. I'd just like to comment briefly. Just the other day, as I'm recording this, I recorded a very long commentary on the early 2021 Richard Wolff and Destiny streamer debate. And this is more or less what I was saying about Richard Wolff. We can build a lot of co-ops and eventually capitalism will just go away. That's directly what Lenin is speaking against here. Every time I've ever heard Richard Wolff in particular pinned down, whether it was in that conversation or his appearance on Fox News or any time he gets asked about, but hey, you say that you're a Marxist. That means you want, some kind of force to be used against the bourgeoisie. And whenever he is asked that directly, he always denies it. He always says, no, 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 no. We're talking about a change of systems and we can just, phase it up. Anyway, that, to me, at least, is exactly what Lenin is talking about. Do you have another view? Leave a comment. Okay, continuing on to Chapter 2, the experience of 1848 to 1851. Section 1, the eve of revolution. The first works of mature Marxism, The Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto, appeared just on the eve of the Revolution of 1848. For this reason, in addition to presenting the general principles of Marxism, they reflect to a certain degree the concrete revolutionary situation of the time. It will therefore be more expedient, perhaps, to examine what the authors of these works said about the state immediately before they drew conclusions from the experience of the years 1848 to 1851. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx wrote, quote, "The working class, in the course of development, will substitute for the old bourgeois society an association which will preclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power groups, since the political power is precisely the official expression of class antagonism in bourgeois society," unquote. It is instructive to compare this general exposition of the idea of the state disappearing after the abolition of classes with the exposition contained in the Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels a few months later, in November 1847 to be exact. Quote, "In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war, raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat." Quoting again, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy." Quoting again, "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible," unquote. Here we have a formulation of one of the most remarkable and most important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely, the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels began to call it after the Paris Commune, and also a highly interesting definition of the state, which is also one of the forgotten words of Marxism, quote, "the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class." This definition of the state has never been explained in the prevailing propaganda and agitation literature of the official social democratic parties. More than that, it has been deliberately ignored, for it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism and is a slap in the face for the common opportunist prejudices and Philistine illusions about the, quote, "peaceful development of democracy." The proletariat needs the state. This is repeated by all the opportunists, social chauvinists, and Kautskyites who assure us that this is what Marx taught, but they, quote, "forget to add that, in the first place, according to Marx, the proletariat needs only a state which is withering away, i.e. a state so constituted that it begins to wither away immediately, and cannot but wither away. And secondly, the working people need a, quote, state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class." The state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, only the exploiting class, i.e. the bourgeoisie. The working people need the state only to suppress the resistance of the exploiters, and only the proletariat can direct this suppression, can carry it out. For the proletariat is the only class that is consistently revolutionary, the only class that can unite all the working and exploited people in the struggle against the bourgeoisie, in completely removing it. The exploited classes need political rule to maintain exploitation, i.e., in the selfish interests of an insignificant minority, against the vast majority of all people. The exploited classes need political rule in order to completely abolish all exploitation, i.e., in the interests of the vast majority of the people, and against the insignificant minority consisting of the modern slave owners, the landowners, and capitalists. The petty bourgeois Democrats, those sham socialists, who replaced the class struggle by dreams of class harmony, even pictured the socialist transformation in a dreamy fashion, not as the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but as the peaceful submission of the minority to the majority, which has become aware of its aims. This petty bourgeois utopia, which is inseparable from the idea of the state being above classes, led in practice to the betrayal of the interests of the working classes, as was shown, for example, by the history of the French revolutions of 1848 and 1871, and by the experience of, quote, socialist participation in bourgeois cabinets in Britain, France, Italy, and other countries at the turn of the century. All his life, Marx fought against this petty bourgeois socialism, now revived in Russia by the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik parties. He developed his theory of the class struggle consistently, down to the theory of political power, of the state. The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, the particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare it for this task and provide it with the possibility and the power to perform it. While the bourgeoisie break up and disintegrate the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, they weld together, unite, and organize the proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all the working and exploited people, whom the bourgeoisie exploit, oppress, and crush, often not less, but more than they do the proletarians, but who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their emancipation. The theory of class struggle, applied by Marx to the question of the state and the socialist revolution, leads as a matter of course to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e., of undivided power directly backed by the armed force of the people. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be achieved only by the proletariat becoming the ruling class, capable of crushing the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie, and of organizing all the working and exploited people for the new economic system. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and semi-proletarians, in the work of organizing a socialist economy. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming power and leading the whole people to socialism, of directing and organizing the new system, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all the working and exploited people in organizing their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. By contrast, the opportunism now prevailing trains the members of the Workers' Party to be the representatives of the better paid workers, who lose touch with the masses, get along fairly well under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a massive pottage, i.e., renounce their role as revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie. Marx's theory of, quote, the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, is inseparably bound up with the whole of his doctrine of the revolutionary role of the proletariat in history. The culmination of this rule is the proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. But since the proletariat needs the state as a special form of organization of violence against the bourgeoisie, the following conclusion suggests itself. Is it conceivable that such an organization can be created without first abolishing, destroying the state machine created by the bourgeoisie for themselves? The Communist Manifesto leads straight to this conclusion, and it is of this conclusion that Marx speaks when summing up the experience of the Revolution of 1848 to 1851. End of section 1, moving on to section 2, the Revolution summed up. Marx sums up his conclusions from the Revolution of 1848 to 51 on the subject of the state we are concerned with in the following argument contained in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, quote, "But the revolution is thoroughgoing. It is still journeying through purgatory, It does its work methodically. By December 2, 1851, the day of Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat, it had completed one half of its preparatory work. It is now completing the other half. First, it perfected the parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now that it has attained this, it is perfecting the executive power, reducing it to its purest expression, isolating it, setting it up against itself as the sole object, in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it. And when it has done this second half of its preliminary work, Europe will leap from its seat and exultantly exclaim, "Well grubbed, old mole." Quoting again, this executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its vast and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this appalling parasitic body, which enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system, which it helped to hasten. The first French Revolution developed centralization, but at the same time, it increased the extent, the attributes, and the number of agents of governmental power. Napoleon completed this state machinery. The legitimate monarchy and the July monarchy added nothing but a greater division of labor. Quoting again, finally, in its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen, along with repressive measures, the resources and centralization of governmental power. All revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it. The parties that contended in turn for domination regarded the possession of this huge state edifice as the principal spoils of the victor, unquote. In this remarkable argument, Marxism takes a tremendous step forward compared with the Communist Manifesto. In the latter, the question of the state is still treated in an extremely abstract manner, in the most general terms and expressions. In the above quoted passage, the question is treated in a concrete manner, and the conclusion is extremely precise, definite, practical, and palpable. All previous revolutions perfected the state machine, whereas it must be broken, smashed. This conclusion is the chief and fundamental point in the Marxist theory of the state, and it is precisely this fundamental point which has been completely ignored by the dominant official social democratic parties, and indeed distorted, as we shall see later, by the foremost theoretician of the Second International, Karl Kautsky. The Communist Manifesto gives a general summary of history, which compels us to regard the state as the organ of class rule, and leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the proletariat cannot overthrow the bourgeoisie without first winning political power, without attaining political supremacy, without transforming the state into the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and that this proletarian state will begin to wither away immediately after its victory, because the state is unnecessary and cannot exist in a society in which there are no class antagonisms. The question as to how, from the point of view of historical development, the replacement of the bourgeois by the proletarian state is to take place is not raised here. This is the question Marx raises and answers in 1852. True to his philosophy of dialectical materialism, Marx takes as his basis the historical experience of the great years of revolution, 1848 to 1851. Here, as everywhere else, his theory is a summing up of experience, illuminated by a profound philosophical conception of the world and a rich knowledge of history. The problem of the state is put specifically. How did the bourgeois state, the state machine necessary for the rule of the bourgeoisie, come into being historically? What changes did it undergo? What evolution did it perform in the course of bourgeois revolutions and in the face of the independent actions of the oppressed classes? What are the tasks of the proletariat in relation to this state machine? The centralized state power that is peculiar to bourgeois society came into being in the period of the fall of absolutism. Two institutions most characteristic of this state machine are the bureaucracy and the standing army. In their works, Marx and Engels repeatedly show that the bourgeoisie are connected with these institutions by thousands of threads. Every worker's experience illustrates this connection in an extremely graphic and impressive manner. From its own bitter experience, the working class learns to recognize this connection. That is why it so easily grasps and so firmly learns the doctrine which shows the inevitability of this connection, a doctrine which the petty bourgeois Democrats either ignorantly and flippantly deny, or still more flippantly admit in general, while forgetting to draw appropriate practical conclusions. The bureaucracy and the standing army are a parasite on the body of bourgeois society, a parasite created by the internal antagonisms which rend that society, but a parasite which chokes all its vital pores. The Kautskyite opportunism now prevailing in official social democracy considers the view that the state is a parasitic organism to be the peculiar and exclusive attribute of anarchism. It goes without saying that this distortion of Marxism is a vast advantage to those Philistines who have reduced socialism to the unheard of disgrace of justifying and prettifying the imperialist war by applying to it the concept of, quote, the defense of the fatherland. But it is unquestionably a distortion nevertheless. The development, perfection, and strengthening of the bureaucratic and military apparatus proceeded during all the numerous bourgeois revolutions which Europe has witnessed since the fall of feudalism. In particular, it is the petty bourgeois who are attracted to the side of the big bourgeoisie and are largely subordinated to them through this apparatus, which provides the upper sections of the peasants, small artisans, tradesmen, and the like with comparatively comfortable, quiet, and respectable jobs, raising the holders above the people. Consider what happened in Russia during the 6 months following February 27, 1917. The official posts which formerly were given by preference to the Black Hundreds, comment extreme reactionaries and monarchists, have now become the spoils of the cadets, comment the major bourgeois party, Mensheviks, and social revolutionaries. Nobody has really thought of introducing any serious reforms. Every effort has been made to put them off, quote, until the Constituent Assembly meets, and to steadily put off its convocation until after the war. But there has been no delay, no waiting for the Constituent Assembly in the matter of dividing the spoils of getting the lucrative jobs of ministers, deputy ministers, governors general, etc., etc. The game of combinations that has been played in forming the government has been, in essence, only an expression of this division and redivision of the spoils, which has been going on above and below throughout the country in every department of central and local government. The 6 months between February 27 and August 27, 1917, can be summed up, objectively summed up beyond all dispute, as follows. Reforms shelved, distribution of official jobs accomplished, and mistakes in the distribution corrected by a few redistributions. But the more the bureaucratic apparatus is, quote, redistributed among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, among the cadets, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks in the case of Russia, the more keenly aware the oppressed classes and the proletariat at their head become of their irreconcilable hostility to the whole of bourgeois society. Hence the need for all bourgeois parties, even for the most democratic and, quote, revolutionary democratic among them, to intensify repressive measures against the revolutionary proletariat, to strengthen the apparatus of coercion, i.e. the state machine. This course of events compels the revolution, quote, to concentrate all its forces of destruction against the state power, and to set itself the aim not of improving the state machine, but of smashing and destroying it. It was not logical reasoning, but actual developments, the actual experience of 1848 to 51, that led to the matter being presented in this way. The extent to which Marx held strictly to the solid ground of historical experience can be seen from the fact that in 1852, he did not yet specifically raise the question of what was to take the place of the state machine to be destroyed. Experience had not yet provided material for dealing with this question, which history placed on the agenda later on in 1871. Comment the Paris Commune. In 1852, all that could be established with the accuracy of scientific observation was that the proletarian revolution had approached the task of concentrating all its forces of destruction against the state power, of smashing the state machine. Here the question may arise, is it correct to generalize the experience, observations, and conclusions of Marx, to apply them to a field that is wider than the history of France during the 3 years 1848 to 51? Before proceeding to deal with this question, let us recall a remark made by Engels, and then examine the facts. In his introduction to the third edition of the 18th Brumaire, Engels wrote, quote, "France is the country where, more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles were each time fought out to a finish, and where, consequently, the changing political forms within which they move, and in which their results are summarized, have been stamped in the sharpest outlines. The center of feudalism in the Middle Ages, the model country since the Renaissance of a unified monarchy based on social estates. France demolished feudalism in the Great Revolution and established the rule of the bourgeoisie in a classical purity unequaled by any other European land. And the struggle of the upward-striving proletariat against the ruling bourgeoisie appeared here in an acute form unknown elsewhere," unquote. The last remark is out of date insomuch as since 1871, there has been a lull in the revolutionary struggle of the French proletariat, although, long as this lull may be, it does not at all preclude the possibility that in the coming proletarian revolution, France may show herself to be the classic country of the class struggle to a finish. Let us, however, cast a general glance over the history of the advanced countries at the turn of the century. We shall see that the same process went on more slowly, in more varied forms, in a much wider field. On the one hand, the development of parliamentary power, both in the republican countries, France, America, Switzerland, and in the monarchies, Britain, Germany to a certain extent, Italy, the Scandinavian countries, etc. On the other hand, a struggle for power among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, which distributed and redistributed the spoils of office, with the foundations of bourgeois society unchanged, and, lastly, the perfection and consolidation of the executive power, of its bureaucratic and military apparatus. There is not the slightest doubt that these features are common to the whole of the modern evolution of all capitalist states in general. In the last 3 years, 1848 to 51, France displayed in a swift, sharp, concentrated form the very same processes of development which are peculiar to the whole capitalist world. Imperialism, the era of bank capital, the era of gigantic capitalist monopolies, of the development of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, has clearly shown an unprecedented growth in its bureaucratic and military apparatus in connection with the intensification of repressive measures against the proletariat, both in the monarchical and in the freest republican countries. World history is now undoubtedly leading, on an incomparably larger scale than in 1852, to the concentration of all forces of the proletarian revolution on the destruction of the state machine. What the proletariat will put in its place is suggested by the highly instructive material furnished by the Paris Commune. That's the end of section 2. Beginning section 3, the presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. In 1907, Mehring, in the magazine Neue Zeit, volume 25, published extracts from Marx's letter to Wedemeyer, dated March 5, 1852. This letter, among other things, contains the following remarkable observation, quote, "And now as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists, the economic anatomy of classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with the particular historical phases in the development of production, two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, three, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society," unquote. In these words, Marx succeeded in expressing with striking clarity, first, the chief and radical difference between his theory and that of the foremost and most profound thinkers of the bourgeoisie, and secondly, the essence of his theory of the state. It is often said and written that the main point in Marx's theory is the class struggle, but this is wrong. And this wrong notion very often results in an opportunist distortion of Marxism and its falsification in a spirit acceptable to the bourgeoisie. For the theory of the class struggle was created not by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and, generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Those who recognize only the class struggle are not yet Marxists. They may be found to be still within the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. To confine Marxism to the theory of the class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is what constitutes the most profound distinction between the Marxist and the ordinary petty as well as big bourgeois. This is the touchstone on which the real understanding and recognition of Marxism should be tested. And it is not surprising that when the history of Europe brought the working class face to face with this question as a practical issue, not only all the opportunists and reformists, but all the Kautskyites, people who vacillate between reformism and Marxism, proved to be miserable Philistines and petty bourgeois Democrats, repudiating the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky's pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in August 1918, i.e. long after the first edition of the present book, is a perfect example of petty bourgeois distortion of Marxism and base renunciation of it in deeds, while hypocritically recognizing it in words. See my pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Opportunism today, as represented by its principal spokesman, the ex-Marxist Karl Kautsky, fits in completely with Marx's characterization of the bourgeois position quoted above, for this opportunism limits recognition of the class struggle to the sphere of bourgeois relations. Within this sphere, within its framework, not a single educated liberal will refuse to recognize the class struggle in principle. Opportunism does not extend recognition of the class struggle to the cardinal point, to the period of transition from capitalism to communism, of the overthrow and the complete abolition of the bourgeoisie. In reality, this period inevitably is a period of an unprecedentedly violent class struggle in unprecedentedly acute forms, and consequently, during this period, the state must inevitably be a state that is democratic in a new way, for the proletariat and the propertyless in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. Further, the essence of Marx's theory of the state has been mastered only by those who realize that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from, quote, classless society from communism. Bourgeois states are most varied in form, but their essence is the same. All these states, whatever their form, in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism is certainly bound to yield a tremendous abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin's Chapter 2, now beginning Chapter 3, Experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, Marx's Analysis. Section 1. What made the Communards' attempt heroic? It is well known that in the autumn of 1870, a few months before the Commune, Marx warned the Paris workers that any attempt to overthrow the government would be the folly of despair. But when, in March 1871, a decisive battle was forced upon the workers, and they accepted it, when the uprising had become a fact, Marx greeted the proletarian revolution with the greatest enthusiasm, in spite of unfavorable auguries. Marx did not persist in the pedantic attitude of condemning a, quote, untimely movement, as did the ill-famed Russian renegade from Marxism, Plekhanov, who in November 1905 wrote encouragingly about the workers' and peasants' struggle, but after December 1905, comment the First Russian Revolution, cried, liberal fashion, quote, they should not have taken up arms. Marx, however, was not only enthusiastic about the heroism of the Communards, who, as he expressed it, quote, stormed heaven. Comment, the Communards are the people who did the Paris Commune. Although the mass revolutionary movement did not achieve its aim, he regarded it as a historic experience of enormous importance, as a certain advance of the world proletarian revolution, as a practical step that was more important than hundreds of programs and arguments. Marx endeavored to analyze this experiment, to draw tactical lessons from it, and to re-examine his theory in the light of it. The only, quote, correction Marx thought it necessary to make to the Communist Manifesto, he made on the basis of the revolutionary experience of the Paris Commune. The last preface to the new German edition of the Communist Manifesto, signed by both its authors, is dated June 24, 1872. In this preface, the authors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, say that the program of the Communist Manifesto, quote, has in some details become out of date. And they go on to say, quote, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, viz., that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, unquote. The authors took the words that are in single quotation marks in this passage from Marx's book, The Civil War in France. Thus, Marx and Engels regarded one principal and fundamental lesson of the Paris Commune as being of such enormous importance that they introduced it as an important correction into the Communist Manifesto. Most characteristically, it is this important correction that has been distorted by the opportunists. Comment, I had this very conversation with people on Twitter last year. It is definitely still going on to this day. Continuing. And its meaning probably is not known to 9/10, if not 99/100, of the readers of the Communist Manifesto. We shall deal with this distortion more fully farther on, in a chapter devoted specially to distortions. Here it will be sufficient to note that the current vulgar, quote, interpretation of Marx's famous statement just quoted is that Marx here allegedly emphasizes the idea of slow development, in contradistinction to the seizure of power, and so on. As a matter of fact, the exact opposite is the case. Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, smash the, quote, ready-made state machinery, and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. On April 12, 1871, i.e. just at the time of the Commune, Marx wrote to Kugelmann, quote, if you look up the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I declare that the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer, as before, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. And this is the precondition for every real people's revolution on the continent, and this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting, unquote. The words, to smash the bureaucratic military machine, briefly express the principal lesson of Marxism regarding the tasks of the proletariat during a revolution in relation to the state. And this is the lesson that has been not only completely ignored, but positively distorted by the prevailing Kautskyite, quote, interpretation of Marxism. Comment, pretty much every time that Lenin writes interpretation here, meaning distortion, not a valid interpretation or an honest interpretation, it is in quotes, meant sarcastically. Continuing. As for Marx's reference to the 18th Brumaire, we have quoted the relevant passage in full above. It is interesting to note, in particular, 2 points in the above-quoted argument of Marx. First, he restricts his conclusion to the continent. This was understandable in 1871, when Britain was still the model of a purely capitalist country, but without a militarist clique, and to a considerable degree without a bureaucracy. Marx therefore excluded Britain, where a revolution, even a people's revolution, then seemed possible, and indeed was possible, without the precondition of destroying ready-made state machinery. Today, in 1917, at the time of the first great imperialist war, this restriction made by Marx is no longer valid. Both Britain and America, the biggest and the last representatives in the whole world of Anglo-Saxon, quote, liberty, in the sense that they had no militarist cliques and bureaucracy, have completely sunk into the all-European, filthy, bloody morass of bureaucratic military institutions which subordinate everything to themselves and suppress everything today. Today, in Britain and America too, quote, the precondition for every real people's revolution is the smashing, the destruction of the ready-made state machinery, made and brought up to the European general imperialist perfection in those countries in the years 1914 to 17. comment. So Lenin is saying here that World War I, 1914 to 1917, is what made all the advanced capitalist countries into this form of bureaucratic military institutions with the full standing army, etc. Now, I say sometimes that it's my prediction that the United States will be the last country on earth to go socialist, in part because pretty much the entire global imperialist system has put all of its eggs in this basket. The US is that standing army that does all the heavy lifting for global imperialism. How is the proletariat of the United States to try to smash the massive military-industrial complex? I think it might take the entire world to do that. I mean, maybe it won't, and the sooner it comes down, the better. The sooner we can have peace, because they're really just there to enforce inequality, as the dictatorship of the international imperialist bourgeoisie. And one other point before moving on, Lenin talks here about the sort of old school capitalists who ruled Britain before the establishment of this new military bureaucratic machine. If you go through US history, you can hear various warnings against the standing army from capitalists and slaveholders, like the bourgeoisie of their day. But it's just capitalism had not evolved to the state yet. So you'll see reactionaries and people who aren't socialists, don't have class consciousness, etc., referencing some of these things. And it's like, well, George Washington warned against a standing army, and okay, that doesn't mean we should adopt the politics of George Washington, however, which are hopelessly out of date and don't apply to our class situation. Anyway, that's a conversation for another time. Continuing. Secondly, particular attention should be paid to Marx's extremely profound remark that the destruction of the bureaucratic military state machine is, quote, the precondition for every real people's revolution. The idea of a people's revolution seems strange coming from Marx, so that the Russian Plekhanovites and Mensheviks, those followers of Struve who wish to be regarded as Marxists, might possibly declare such an expression to be a slip of the pen on Marx's part. They have reduced Marxism to such a state of wretchedly liberal distortion that nothing exists for them beyond the antithesis between bourgeois revolution and proletarian revolution, and even this antithesis they interpret in an utterly lifeless way. If we take the revolutions of the 20th century as examples, we shall of course have to admit that the Portuguese and the Turkish revolutions are both bourgeois revolutions. Neither of them, however, is a people's revolution, since in neither does the mass of the people, their vast majority, come out actively, independently, with their own economic and political demands to any noticeable degree. By contrast, although the Russian bourgeois revolution of 1905 to 07 displayed no such brilliant successes as at time fell to the Portuguese and Turkish revolutions, it was undoubtedly a, quote, real people's revolution, since the mass of the people, their majority, the very lowest social groups, crushed by oppression and exploitation, rose independently and stamped on the entire course of the revolution the imprint of their own demands, their attempt to build in their own way a new society in place of the old society that was being destroyed. In Europe, in 1871, the proletariat did not constitute the majority of the people in any country on the continent. A, quote, people's revolution, one actually sweeping the majority into its stream, could be such only if it embraced both the proletariat and the peasants. These two classes then constituted the people. These two classes are united by the fact that the bureaucratic military state machine oppresses, crushes, exploits them. To smash this machine, to break it up, is truly in the interest of the people, of their majority, of the workers and most of the peasants, is the precondition for a free alliance of the poor peasant and the proletarians, whereas without such an alliance, democracy is unstable, and socialist transformation is impossible. As is well known, the Paris Commune was actually working its way towards such an alliance, although it did not reach its goal owing to a number of circumstances, internal and external. Consequently, in speaking of a real people's revolution, Marx, without in the least discounting the special features of the petty bourgeois, he spoke a great deal about them, and often, took strict account of the actual balance of class forces in most of the continental countries of Europe in 1871. On the other hand, he stated that the smashing of the state machine was required by the interests of both the workers and the peasants, that it united them, that it placed before them the common task of removing the parasite and of replacing it by something new. By what exactly? That's the end of section 1. On to section 2. What is to replace the smashed state machine? In 1847, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx's answer to this question was as yet a purely abstract one. To be exact, it was an answer that indicated the tasks, but not the ways of accomplishing them. The answer given in the Communist Manifesto was that this machine was to be replaced by, quote, the proletariat organized as the ruling class, by the, quote, winning of the battle of democracy, unquote. Marx did not indulge in utopias. He expected the experience of the mass movement to provide the reply to the question as to the specific forms this organization of the proletariat as the ruling class would assume, and as to the exact manner in which this organization would be combined with the most complete, most consistent, quote, winning of the battle of democracy. Marx subjected the experience of the Commune, meager as it was, to the most careful analysis in the Civil War in France. Let us quote the most important passages of this work. Quote, originating from the Middle Ages, there developed in the 19th century the centralized state power, with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judicature. With the development of class antagonisms between capital and labor, state power assumed more and more the character of a public force organized for the suppression of the working class, of a machine of class rule. After every revolution, which marks an advance in the class struggle, the purely coercive character of the state power stands out in bolder and bolder relief. After the revolution of 1848 to 49, state power became, quote, the national war instruments of capital against labor. The Second Empire consolidated this. The direct antithesis to the empire was the Commune. It was the specific form of a republic that was not only to remove the monarchical form of class rule, but class rule itself, unquote. What was this specific form of the proletarian socialist republic? What was the state it began to create? Quote, the first decree of the Commune, therefore, was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people, unquote. This demand now figures in the program of every party calling itself socialist. The real worth of their program, however, is best shown by the behavior of our social revolutionists and Mensheviks, who right after the revolution of February 27 refused to carry out this demand. Quote, the Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at any time. The majority of its members were naturally working men, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The police, which until then had been the instrument of the government, was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at all times revocable agent of the Commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. From the members of the Commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The privileges and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the instruments of physical force of the old government, the Commune proceeded at once to break the instrument of spiritual suppression, the power of the priests. The judicial functionaries lost that sham independence. They were thenceforth to be elective, responsible, and revocable, unquote. The Commune, therefore, appears to have replaced the smashed state machine, quote, only by fuller democracy, abolition of the standing army, all officials to be elected and subject to recall. But as a matter of fact, this, quote, only signifies a gigantic replacement of certain institutions by other institutions of a fundamentally different type. This is exactly a case of, quote, quantity being transformed into quality. Democracy, introduced as fully and consistently as is at all conceivable, is transformed from bourgeois into proletarian democracy, from the state, meaning a special force for the suppression of a particular class, into something which is no longer the state proper. It is still necessary to suppress the bourgeoisie and crush their resistance. This was particularly necessary for the Commune, and one of the reasons for its defeat was that it did not do this with sufficient determination. The organ of suppression, however, is here the majority of the population, and not a minority, as was always the case under slavery, serfdom, and wage slavery. And since the majority of people itself suppresses its oppressors, a special force for suppression is no longer necessary. In this sense, the state begins to wither away. Instead of the special institutions of a privileged minority, privileged officialdom, the chiefs of the standing army, the majority itself can directly fulfill all these functions, and the more the functions of state power are performed by the people as a whole, the less need there is for the existence of this power. In this connection, the following measures of the Commune, emphasized by Marx, are particularly noteworthy: the abolition of all representation allowances and of all monetary privileges to officials, the reduction of the remuneration of all servants of the state to the level of workmen's wages. This shows more clearly than anything else the turn from bourgeois to proletarian democracy, from the democracy of the oppressors to that of the oppressed classes, from the state as a, quote, special force for the suppression of a particular class to the suppression of the oppressors by the general force of the majority of the people, the workers and the peasants. And it is on this particularly striking point, perhaps the most important as far as the problem of the state is concerned, that the ideas of Marx have been most completely ignored. In popular commentaries, the number of which is legion, this is not mentioned. The thing done is to keep silent about it as if it were a piece of old-fashioned naivete, just as Christians, after their religion had been given the status of state religion, forgot the naivete of primitive Christianity with its democratic revolutionary spirit. The reduction of the remuneration of high state officials seem, quote, simply a demand of naive, primitive democracy. One of the, quote, founders of modern opportunism, the ex-social democrat Edward Bernstein, has more than once repeated the vulgar bourgeois jeers at, quote, primitive democracy. Like all opportunists, and like the present Kautskyites, he did not understand at all that, first of all, the transition from capitalism to socialism is impossible without a certain, quote, reversion to, quote, primitive democracy. For how else can the majority, and then the whole population without exception, proceed to discharge state functions? And that, secondly, quote, primitive democracy, based on capitalism and capitalist culture, is not the same as primitive democracy in prehistoric or pre-capitalist times. Capitalist culture has created large-scale production, factories, railways, the postal service, telephones, etc. And on this basis, the great majority of the functions of the old, quote, state power have become so simplified and can be reduced to such exceedingly simple operations of registration, filing, and checking that they can be easily performed by every literate person, can quite easily be performed for ordinary workmen's wages, and that these functions can and must be stripped of every shadow of privilege, of every semblance of, quote, official grandeur. Comment, that was true in Lenin's day, 100 years later, with computerization, all the more so. Continuing. All officials, without exception, elected and subject to recall at any time, their salaries reduced to the level of ordinary workmen's wages. These simple and, quote, self-evident democratic measures, while completely uniting the interests of the workers and the majority of the peasants, at the same time serve as a bridge leading from capitalism to socialism. These measures concern the reorganization of the state, the purely political reorganization of society, but of course, they acquire their full meaning and significance only in connection with the, quote, expropriation of the expropriators, either being accomplished or in preparation, i.e. with the transformation of capitalist private ownership of the means of production into social ownership. Quote, the Commune, Marx wrote, made the catchword of all bourgeois revolutions, cheap government, a reality by abolishing the two greatest sources of expenditure, the army and the officialdom, unquote. From the peasants, as from other sections of the petty bourgeoisie, only an insignificant few rise to the top or get on in the world in the bourgeois sense, i.e., become either well-to-do, bourgeois, or officials in secure and privileged positions. In every capitalist country where there are peasants, as there are in most capitalist countries, the vast majority of them are oppressed by the government and long for its overthrow, long for, quote, cheap government. This can be achieved only by the proletariat, and by achieving it, the proletariat at the same time takes a step towards the socialist reorganization of the state. End of section 2, beginning of section 3, abolition of parliamentarism. Quote, the commune, Marx wrote, was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. Quote, instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to represent and repress the people in parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people constituted in communes, as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for workers, foremen, and accountants for his business, unquote. Owing to the prevalence of social chauvinism and opportunism, this remarkable criticism of parliamentarism, made in 1871, also belongs now to the, quote, forgotten words of Marxism. The professional cabinet ministers and parliamentarians, the traitors to the proletariat, and the, quote, practical socialists of our day, have left all criticism of parliamentarism to the anarchists, and on this wonderfully reasonable ground, they denounce all criticism of parliamentarism as, quote, anarchism. It is not surprising that the proletariat of the, quote, advanced parliamentary countries, disgusted with such, quote, socialists as the Scheidemans, Davids, Legines, Sembats, Renaudels, Hendersons, Vanderveldes, Staunings, Brantings, Bisolatis, and company, has been with increasing frequency giving its sympathies to anarcho-syndicalism, in spite of the fact that the latter is merely the twin brother of opportunism. For Marx, however, revolutionary dialectics was never the empty fashionable phrase, the toy rattle, which Plekhanov, Kautsky, and others have made of it. Marx knew how to break with anarchism ruthlessly for its inability to make use even of the pigsty of bourgeois parliamentarism, especially when the situation was obviously not revolutionary. But at the same time, he knew how to subject parliamentarism to genuinely revolutionary proletarian criticism. To decide once every few years which members of the ruling class is to repress and crush the people through parliament, this is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism, not only in parliamentary constitutional monarchies, but also in the most democratic republics. But if we deal with the question of the state, and if we consider parliamentarism as one of the institutions of the state, from the point of view of the tasks of the proletariat in this field, what is the way out of parliamentarism? How can it be dispensed with? Once again, we must say, the lessons of Marx, based on the study of the Commune, have been so completely forgotten that the present-day, quote, social democrat, i.e. present-day traitor to socialism, really cannot understand any criticism of parliamentarism other than anarchist or reactionary criticism. The way out of parliamentarism is not, of course, the abolition of representative institutions and the elective principle, but the conversion of the representative institutions from talking shops into working bodies. Quote, the Commune was supposed to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time, unquote. A working, not a parliamentary body. This is a blow straight from the shoulder at the present-day parliamentarian country, from America to Switzerland, from France to Britain, Norway, and so forth. In these countries, the real business of state is performed behind the scenes and is carried on by the departments, chancelleries, and general staffs. Parliament is given up to talk for the special purpose of fooling the common people. Wow, this is spot on, actually, especially for 100 years ago. Continuing, this is so true that even in the Russian Republic, a bourgeois democratic republic, all these sins of parliamentarism came out at once, even before it managed to set up a real parliament. The heroes of rotten Philistinism, such as the Skobalevs and Tseretellis, the Chernovs and Avksentievs, have even succeeded in polluting the Soviets after the fashion of the most disgusting bourgeois parliamentarism, in converting them into mere talking shops. In the Soviets, the, quote, socialist ministers are fooling the credulous rustics with phrase-mongering and resolutions. In the government itself, a sort of permanent shuffle is going on, in order that, on the one hand, as many socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks as possible may in turn get near the pie, the lucrative and honorable posts, and that, on the other hand, the attention of the people may be engaged. Meanwhile, the chancelleries and army staffs do the business of state. Dielo Naroda, the organ of the ruling Socialist Revolutionary Party, recently admitted in a leading article, with the matchless frankness of people of, quote, good society, in which all are engaged in political prostitution, that even in the ministries headed by the socialists, save the mark, the whole bureaucratic apparatus is in fact unchanged, is working in the old way, and quite freely sabotaging revolutionary measures. Even without this admission, does not the actual history of the participation of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks in the government prove this? It is noteworthy, however, that in the ministerial company of the cadets, the Chernovs, Rusinovs, Zenzinovs, and other editors of Dielo Naroda have so completely lost all sense of shame as to brazenly assert, as if it were a mere bagatelle, that in, quote, their ministries, everything is unchanged. Revolutionary democratic phrases to gull the rural simple Simons, and bureaucracy and red tape to, quote, gladden the hearts of the capitalists. That is the essence of the honest coalition. The Commune substitutes for the venal and rotten parliamentarism of bourgeois society institutions in which freedom of opinion and discussion does not degenerate into deception, for the parliamentarians themselves have to work, have to execute their own laws, have themselves to test the results achieved in reality, and to account directly to their constituents. Representative institutions remain, but there is no parliamentarism here as a special system, as the division of labor between the legislative and the executive, as a privileged position for the deputies. We cannot imagine democracy, even proletarian democracy, without representative institutions, but we can and must imagine democracy without parliamentarism, if criticism of bourgeois society is not mere words for us, if the desire to overthrow the rule of the bourgeoisie is our earnest and sincere desire, and not a mere election cry for catching workers' votes, as it is with the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, and also the Scheidemans and Legines, the Semblats and Vandervelds. It is extremely instructive to note that, in speaking of the function of those officials who are necessary for the commune and for proletarian democracy, Marx compares them to the workers of every other employer, that is, of the ordinary capitalist enterprise, with its workers, foremen, and accountants. There is no trace of utopianism in Marx, in the sense that he made up or invented a, quote, new society. No, he studied the birth of the new society out of the old, and the forms of transition from the latter to the former, as a mass proletarian movement, and tried to draw practical lessons from it. He learned from the Commune, just as all the great revolutionary thinkers learned unhesitatingly from the experience of great movements of the oppressed classes, and never addressed them with pedantic homilies such as Plekhanov's, they should not have taken up arms, or Tseretelli's. A class must limit itself. Abolishing the bureaucracy at once, everywhere and completely is out of the question. It is a utopia. But to smash the old bureaucratic machine at once and to begin immediately to construct a new one, that will make possible the gradual abolition of all bureaucracy. This is not a utopia. It is the experience of the commune, the direct and immediate task of the revolutionary proletariat. Capitalism simplifies the functions of state administration. It makes it possible to cast bossing aside and to confine the whole matter to the organization of the proletarians, as the ruling class, which will hire workers, foremen, and accountants in the name of the whole of society. We are not utopians. We do not dream of dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon incomprehension of the tasks of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism, and, as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No, we want the socialist revolution with people as they are now, with people who cannot dispense with subordination, control, and foremen and accountants. The subordination, however, must be to the armed vanguard of all the exploited and working people, i.e. to the proletariat. A beginning can and must be made at once, overnight, to replace the specific bossing of state officials by the simple functions of foremen and accountants, functions which are already fully within the ability of the average town dweller and can well be performed for workmen's wages. We, the workers, shall organize large-scale production on the basis of what capitalism has already created, relying on our own experience as workers, establishing strict, iron discipline, backed up by the state power of the armed workers. We shall reduce the role of state officials to that of simply carrying out our instructions as responsible, revocable, modestly paid foremen and accountants, of course, with the aid of technicians of all sorts, types, and degrees. This is our proletarian task. This is what we can and must start with in accomplishing the proletarian revolution. Such a beginning, on the basis of large-scale production, will of itself lead to the gradual withering away of all bureaucracy, to the gradual creation of an order without inverted commas, an order bearing no similarity to wage slavery, an order under which the functions of control and accounting, becoming more and more simple, will be performed by each in turn, will then become a habit, and will finally die out as the special functions of a special section of the population. A witty German social democrat of the 70s of the last century called the postal service an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true. At the present, the postal service is a business organized on the lines of state capitalist monopoly. Imperialism is gradually transforming all trusts into organizations of a similar type, in which, standing over the, quote, common people, who are overworked and starved, one has the same bourgeois bureaucracy. But the mechanism of social management is here already to hand. Once we have overthrown the capitalists, crushed the resistance of these exploiters with the iron hand of the armed workers, and smashed the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state, we shall have a splendidly equipped mechanism, freed from the parasite, a mechanism which can very well be set going by the united workers themselves, who will hire technicians, foremen, and accountants, and pay them all, as indeed all state officials in general, workmen's wages. Here is a concrete, practical task which can immediately be fulfilled in relation to all trusts, a task whose fulfillment will rid the working people of exploitation, a task which takes account of what the commune had already begun to practice, particularly in building up the state. To organize the whole economy on the lines of the postal service, so that the technicians, foremen, and accountants, as well as all officials, shall receive salaries no higher than a workman's wage, all under the control and leadership of the armed proletariat. That is our immediate aim. This is what will bring about the abolition of parliamentarism and the preservation of representative institutions. This is what will rid the laboring classes of the bourgeoisie's prostitution of these institutions. End of section 3, beginning section 4, Organization of National Unity. Quote, in a brief sketch of national organization, which the Commune had no time to develop, it states explicitly that the Commune was to be the political form of even the smallest village. These communes were to elect the national delegation in Paris. Quote, the few but important functions which would still remain for a central government were not to be suppressed, as had been deliberately misstated, but were to be transferred to communal, i.e. strictly responsible officials. Quoting again, national unity was not to be broken, but on the contrary, organized by the communal institution. It was to become a reality by the destruction of state power, which posed as the embodiment of that unity, yet wanted to be independent of, and superior to the nation, on whose body it was but a parasitic excrescence. While the merely repressive organs of the old governmental power were to be amputated, its legitimate functions were to be wrested from an authority claiming the right to stand above society, and restored to the responsible servants of society. End quote. The extent to which the opportunists of present-day social democracy have failed, perhaps it would be more true to say, have refused to understand these observations of Marx, is best shown by that book of Herostratian fame of the renegade Bernstein, the premises of socialism and the tasks of the Social Democrats. It is in connection with the above passage from Marx that Bernstein wrote that, quote, as far as its political content, this program displays, in all its essential features, the greatest similarity to the federalism of Proudhon, in spite of all the other points of difference between Marx and the petit bourgeois Proudhon. Bernstein places the word petit bourgeois in inverted commas to make it sound ironic. On these points, their lines of reasoning run as close as could be, unquote. Of course, Bernstein continues, the importance of municipalities is growing, but, quote, it seems doubtful to me whether the first job of democracy would be such a dissolution of the modern states and such a complete transformation of their organization as is visualized by Marx and Proudhon, the formation of a national assembly from delegates of the provincial of district assemblies, which in their turn would consist of delegates from the communes, so that consequently the previous mode of national representation would disappear, unquote. It's quoting from Bernstein's Premises, 1899. To confuse Marx's view on the destruction of state power, a parasitic excrescence, with Proudhon's federalism is positively monstrous. But it is no accident, for it never occurs to the opportunist that Marx does not speak here at all about federalism as opposed to centralism, but about smashing the old bourgeois state machine which exists in all bourgeois countries. The only thing that does occur to the opportunist is what he sees around him in an environment of petty bourgeois philistinism and reformists' stagnation, namely only, quote, municipalities. The opportunist has even grown out of the habit of thinking about proletarian revolution. It is ridiculous, but the remarkable thing is that nobody argued with Bernstein on this point. Bernstein has been refuted by many, especially by Plekhanov in Russian literature and by Kautsky in European literature, but neither of them has said anything about this distortion of Marx by Bernstein. The opportunist has so much forgotten how to think in a revolutionary way and to dwell on revolution that he attributes, quote, federalism to Marx, whom he confuses with the founder of anarchism, Proudhon. As for Kautsky and Plekhanov, who claim to be orthodox Marxists and defenders of the theory of revolutionary Marxism, they are silent on this point. Here is one of the roots of the extreme vulgarization of the views on the difference between Marxism and anarchism, which is characteristic of both the Kautskyites and the opportunists, and which we shall discuss again later. There is not a trace of federalism in Marx's above-quoted observation on the experience of the commune. Marx agreed with Proudhon on the very point that the opportunist Bernstein did not see. Marx disagreed with Proudhon on the very point on which Bernstein found a similarity between them. Marx agreed with Proudhon in that they both stood for the smashing of the modern state machine. Neither the opportunists nor the Kautskyites wished to see the similarity of views on this point between Marxism and anarchism, both Proudhon and Bakunin, because this is where they have departed from Marxism. Marx disagreed with both Proudhon and Bakunin precisely on the question of federalism, not to mention the dictatorship of the proletariat. Federalism as a principle follows logically from the petty bourgeois views of anarchism. Marx was a centralist. There's no departure whatsoever from centralism in his observations just quoted. Only those who are imbued with the Philistine, superstitious belief in the state can mistake the destruction of the bourgeois state machine for the destruction of centralism. Now, if the proletariat and the poor peasants take state power into their own hands, organize themselves quite freely in communes, and unite the action of all the communes in striking at capital, in crushing the resistance of the capitalists, and in transferring the privately owned railways, factories, land, and so on to the entire nation, to the whole of society, won't that be centralism? Won't that be the most consistent democratic centralism, and moreover, proletarian centralism? Bernstein simply cannot conceive of the possibility of voluntary centralism, of the voluntary fusion of the proletarian communes, for the sole purpose of destroying bourgeois rule and the bourgeois state machine. Like all Philistines, Bernstein pictures centralism as something which can be imposed and maintained solely from above, and solely by the bureaucracy and military clique. As though foreseeing that his views might be distorted, Marx expressly maintained that the charge that the Commune had wanted to destroy national unity, to abolish the central authority, was a deliberate fraud. Marx purposely used the words, quote, national unity was to be organized, so as to oppose conscious democratic proletarian centralism to bourgeois military bureaucratic centralism. But there are none so deaf as those who will not hear. And the very thing the opportunists of present-day social democracy do not want to hear about is the destruction of state power, the amputation of the parasitic excrescence. That's the end of section 4, beginning section 5, abolition of the parasite state. We have already quoted Marx's words on the subject, and we must now supplement them. Quote, "It is generally the fate of new historical creations," he wrote, "to be mistaken for the counterpart of older and even defunct forms of social life, to which they may bear a certain likeness. Thus, this new commune, which breaks the modern state power, has been regarded as a revival of the medieval communes, as a federation of small states, as Montesquieu and the Girondins visualized it, as an exaggerated form of the old struggle against over-centralization." Quoting again, "The communal constitution would have restored to the social body all the forces hitherto absorbed by that parasitic excrescence, the state, feeding upon and hampering the free movement of society. By this one act, it would have initiated the regeneration of France." Quoting again, "The communal constitution would have brought the rural producers under the intellectual lead of the central towns of their districts, and there secured to them, in the town working men, the natural trustees of their interests. The very existence of the commune involved, as a matter of course, local self-government, but no longer as a counterpoise to state power, now become superfluous." Unquote. Breaking state power, which as a parasitic excrescence, its amputation, its smashing, state power now becomes superfluous. These are the expressions Marx used in regard to the state when appraising and analyzing the experience of the commune. All this was written a little less than half a century ago, and now one has to engage in excavations, as it were, in order to bring undistorted Marxism to the knowledge of the mass of the people. The conclusions drawn from the observation of the last great revolution, which Marx lived through, were forgotten just when the time for the next great proletarian revolution has arrived. Quote, "The multiplicity of interpretations to which the commune has been subjected, and the multiplicity of interests which expressed themselves in it, show that it was a thoroughly flexible political form, while all previous forms of government had been essentially repressive. Its true secret was this: it was essentially a working-class government, the result of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which the economic emancipation of labor could be accomplished. Except on this last condition, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion." Unquote. The utopians busied themselves with, quote, "discovering political forms under which the socialist transformation of society was to take place. The anarchists dismissed the question of political forms altogether. The opportunists of present-day social democracy accepted the bourgeois political forms of the parliamentary democratic state as the limit which should not be overstepped. They battered their foreheads, praying before this, quote, model, and denounced as anarchism every desire to break these forms." Marx deduced from the whole history of socialism and the political struggle that the state was bound to disappear, and that the transitional form of its disappearance, the transition from state to non-state, would be the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Marx, however, did not set out to discover the political forms of this future stage. He limited himself to carefully observing French history, to analyzing it, and to drawing the conclusion to which the year 1851 had led, namely, that matters were moving towards destruction of the bourgeois state machine. And when the mass revolutionary movement of the proletariat burst forth, Marx, in spite of its failure, in spite of its short life and patent weakness, began to study the forms it had discovered. The commune is the form, quote, "at last discovered" by the proletarian revolution, under which the economic emancipation of labor can take place. The commune is the first attempt by a proletarian revolution to smash the bourgeois state machine, and it is the political form, at last discovered, by which the smashed state machine can and must be replaced. We shall see further on that the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, in different circumstances and under different conditions, continue the work of the Commune and confirm Marx's brilliant historical analysis. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Now beginning Chapter 4, Supplementary Explanations by Engels. Marx gave the fundamentals concerning the significance of the experience of the Commune. Engels returned to the same subject time and again, and explained Marx's analysis and conclusions, sometimes elucidating other aspects of the question with such power and vividness that it is necessary to deal with his explanations specially. Section 1. The Housing Question. In his work, The Housing Question, Engels already took into account the experience of the Commune and dealt several times with the tasks of the revolution in relation to the state. It is interesting to note that the treatment of this specific subject clearly revealed, on the one hand, points of similarity between the proletarian state and the present state, points that warrant speaking of the state in both cases, and, on the other hand, points of difference between them, or the transition to the destruction of the state. Quote, "How is the housing question to be settled then? In present-day society, it is settled just as any other social question, by the gradual economic leveling of demand and supply, a settlement which reproduces the question itself again and again, and therefore is no settlement. How a social revolution would settle this question not only depends on the circumstances in each particular case, but is also connected with much more far-reaching questions, one of the most fundamental of which is the abolition of the antithesis between town and country. As it is not our task to create utopian systems for the organization of the future society, it would be more than idle to go into that question here. But one thing is certain, there is already a sufficient quantity of houses in the big cities to remedy immediately all real housing shortage, provided that they are used judiciously. This can naturally only occur through the expropriation of the present owners, and by quartering in their houses homeless workers or workers overcrowded in their present homes. As soon as the proletariat has won political power, such a measure prompted by concern for the common good will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations and billetings by the present-day state." Unquote. The change in the form of state power is not examined here, but only the content of its activity. Expropriations and billetings take place by order even of the present state. From the formal point of view, the proletarian state will also, quote, order the occupation of dwellings and expropriation of houses. But it is clear that the old executive apparatus, the bureaucracy, which is connected with the bourgeoisie, would simply be unfit to carry out the orders of the proletarian state. Quote, "It must be pointed out that the actual seizure of all the instruments of labor, the taking possession of industry as a whole by the working people, is the exact opposite of the Proudhonist redemption. In the latter case, the individual worker becomes the owner of the dwelling, the peasant farm, the instruments of labor. In the former case, the working people remain the collective owners of the houses, factories, and instruments of labor, and will hardly permit their use, at least during a transitional period, by individuals or associations without compensation for the cost. In the same way, the abolition of property in land is not the abolition of ground rent, but its transfer, if in a modified form, to society. The actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not at all preclude the retention of rent relations." Unquote. We shall examine the question touched upon in this passage, namely the economic basis for the withering away of the state, in the next chapter. Engels expresses himself most cautiously, saying that the proletarian state would, quote, "hardly permit the use of houses without payment, quote, at least during a transitional period." The letting of houses owned by the whole people to individual families presupposes the collection of rent, a certain amount of control, and the employment of some standard in allotting the housing. All this calls for a certain form of state, but it does not at all call for a special military bureaucratic apparatus, with officials occupying specially privileged positions. The transition to a situation in which it will be possible to supply dwellings rent-free depends on the complete withering away of the state. Speaking of the Blanquists' adoption of the fundamental position of Marxism after the Commune, and under the influence of its experience, Engels, in passing, formulates this position as follows, quote, "Necessity of political action by the proletariat and of its dictatorship as the transition to the abolition of classes, and with them, of the state," unquote. Addicts of hair-splitting criticism, or bourgeois exterminators of Marxism, will perhaps see a contradiction between this recognition of the abolition of the state and repudiation of this formula as an anarchist one in the above passage from Anti-Düring. It would not be surprising if the opportunists classed Engels too as an anarchist, for it is becoming increasingly common with the social chauvinists to accuse the internationalists of anarchism. Marxism has always taught that with the abolition of classes, the state will also be abolished. The well-known passage on the withering away of the state in Anti-Düring accuses the anarchists not simply of favoring the abolition of the state, but of preaching that the state can be abolished overnight. As now, the prevailing social democratic doctrine completely distorts the relation of Marxism to anarchism on the question of the abolition of the state. It will be particularly useful to recall a certain controversy in which Marx and Engels came out against the anarchists. New section, Controversy with the Anarchists. This controversy took place in 1873. Marx and Engels contributed articles against the Proudhonists, autonomists, or anti-authoritarians to an Italian socialist annual, and it was not until 1913 that these articles appeared in German in Neue Zeit. Quote, "If the political struggle of the working classes assumes revolutionary form," wrote Marx, ridiculing the anarchists for their repudiation of politics, "and if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles, for in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs, and to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transient form instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state," unquote. It was solely against this kind of abolition of the state that Marx fought in refuting the anarchists. He did not at all oppose the view that the state would disappear when classes disappeared, or that it would be abolished when classes were abolished. What he did oppose was the proposition that the workers should renounce the use of arms, organized violence, that is, the state, which is to serve to, quote, "crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie." To prevent the true meaning of the struggle against anarchism from being distorted, Marx expressly emphasized the revolutionary and transient form of the state which the proletariat needs. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We maintain that to achieve this aim, we must temporarily make use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. Marx chooses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against the anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of the capitalists, should the workers, quote, "lay down their arms," or use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance? But what is the systematic use of arms by any class against another, if not a transient form of a state? Let every social democrat ask himself, is that how he has been posing the question of the state in controversy with the anarchists? Is that how it has been posed by the vast majority of the official socialist parties of the Second International? Engels expounds the same ideas in much greater detail and still more popularly. First of all, he ridicules the muddled ideas of the Proudhonists, who call themselves anti-authoritarians, i.e. repudiated all authority, all subordination, all power. Take a factory, a railway, a ship on the high seas, said Engels. Is it not clear that not one of these complex technical establishments, based on the use of machinery and the systematic cooperation of many people, could function without a certain amount of subordination and, consequently, without a certain amount of authority or power? Quote, When I counter the most rabid anti-authoritarians with these arguments, the only answer they can give me is the following. Oh, that's true, except that here it is not a question of authority with which we vest our delegates, but of a commission. These people imagine they can change a thing by changing its name, unquote. Having thus shown that authority and autonomy are relative terms, that the sphere of their application varies with the various phases of social development, that it is absurd to take them as absolutes, and adding that the sphere of application of machinery and large-scale production is steadily expanding, Engels passes from the general discussion of authority to the question of the state. Quote, had the autonomists, he wrote, contented themselves with saying that the social organization of the future would allow authority only within the bounds which the conditions of production make inevitable, one could have come to terms with them, but they are blind to all facts that make authority necessary, and they passionately fight the word. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and become mere administrative functions of watching over social interests. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social relations that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is an act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, all of which are highly authoritarian means. And the victorious party must maintain its rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionaries. Would the Paris Commune have lasted more than a day if it had not used the authority of the armed people against the bourgeoisie? Cannot we, on the contrary, blame it for having made too little use of that authority? Therefore, one of two things: either that anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they're creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they're betraying the cause of the proletariat. In either case, they serve only reaction, unquote. This argument touches upon questions which should be examined in connection with the relationship between politics and economics during the withering away of the state. The next chapter is devoted to this. These questions are the transformation of public functions from political into simple functions of administration, and the political state. This last term, one particularly liable to misunderstanding, indicates the process of the withering away of the state. At a certain stage of this process, the state which is withering away may be called a non-political state. Again, the most remarkable thing in this argument of Engels is the way he states his case against the anarchists. Social democrats, claiming to be disciples of Engels, have argued on this subject against the anarchists millions of times since 1873, but they have not argued as Marxists could and should. The anarchist idea of abolition of the state is muddled and non-revolutionary. That is how Engels put it. It is precisely the revolution in its rise and development, with its specific tasks in relation to violence, authority, power, the state, that the anarchists refuse to see. The usual criticism of anarchism by present-day social democrats has boiled down to the purest Philistine banality. Quote, we recognize the state, whereas the anarchists do not. Naturally, such banality cannot but repel workers who are at all capable of thinking and revolutionary-minded. What Engels says is different. He stresses that all socialists recognize that the state will disappear as a result of the socialist revolution. He then deals specifically with the question of the revolution, the very question which, as a rule, the social democrats evade out of opportunism, leaving it, so to speak, exclusively for the anarchists, quote, to work out. And when dealing with this question, Engels takes the bull by the horns. He asks, should not the commune have made more use of the revolutionary power of the state, that is, of the proletariat, armed and organized as the ruling class? Prevailing official social democracy usually dismissed the question of the concrete tasks of the proletariat in the revolution either with a Philistine sneer or at best, with the sophistic evasion, the future will show. And the anarchists were justified in saying about such social democrats that they were failing in their task of giving the workers a revolutionary education. Engels draws upon the experience of the last proletarian revolution precisely for the purpose of making a most concrete study of what should be done by the proletariat, and in what manner, in relation to both the banks and the state. New section, Letter to Bebel. One of the most, if not the most, remarkable observation on the state in the works of Marx and Engels is contained in the following passage in Engels' letter to Bebel, dated March 18 to 28, 1875. This letter, we may observe in parenthesis, was, as far as we know, first published by Bebel in the second volume of his memoirs, which appeared in 1911, i.e. 36 years after the letter had been written and sent. Engels wrote to Bebel criticizing the same draft of the Gotha program which Marx criticized in his famous letter to Brock. Referring specially to the question of the state, Engels said, quote, "The free people's state has been transferred into the free state. Taken in its grammatical sense, a free state is one where the state is free in relation to its citizens, hence a state with a despotic government. The whole talk about the state should be dropped, especially since the commune, which was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word. The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists to the point of disgust, although already Marx's book against Proudhon and later the Communist Manifesto say plainly that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state dissolves of itself and disappears. As the state is only a transitional institution which is used in the struggle, in the revolution, to hold down one's adversaries by force, it is sheer nonsense to talk of a free people's state. So long as the proletariat still needs the state, it does not need it in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries. And as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. We would therefore propose replacing the state everywhere by Gemeinwesen, a good old German word which can very well take the place of the French word commune," unquote. It should be borne in mind that this letter refers to the party program which Marx criticized in a letter dated only a few weeks later than the above. Marx's letter is dated May 5th, 1875, and that at the time Engels was living with Marx in London. Consequently, when he says "we" in the last sentence, Engels undoubtedly, in his own as well as in Marx's name, suggests to the leader of the German Workers' Party that the word state be struck out of the program and replaced with the word community. What a howl about anarchism would be raised by the leading lights of present-day Marxism, quote-unquote, which has been falsified for the convenience of the opportunists, if such an amendment of the program were suggested to them. Let them howl. This will earn them the praises of the bourgeoisie. And we shall go on with our work. In revising the program of our party, we must by all means take the advice of Engels and Marx into consideration in order to come nearer to the truth, to restore Marxism by ridding it of distortions, to guide the struggle of the working class for its emancipation more correctly. Certainly no one opposed to the advice of Engels and Marx will be found among the Bolsheviks. The only difficulty that may perhaps arise will be in regard to the term. In German, there are two words meaning community, of which Engels used the one which does not denote a single community, but their totality, a system of communities. In Russian, there is no such word, and we may have to use the French word commune, although this also has its drawbacks. Quote, "The commune was no longer a state in the proper sense of the word," unquote. This is the most theoretically important statement Engels makes. After what has been said above, this statement is perfectly clear. The commune was ceasing to be a state since it had to suppress not the majority of the population, but a minority, the exploiters. It had smashed the bourgeois state machine. In place of a special coercive force, the population itself came on the scene. All this was a departure from the state in the proper sense of the word, and had the commune become firmly established, all traces of the state in it would have withered away of themselves. It would not have had to abolish the institutions of the state. They would have ceased to function as they ceased to have anything to do. Quote, The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists, unquote. In saying this, Engels, above all, has in mind Bakunin and his attacks on the German Social Democrats. Engels admits that these attacks were justified insofar as the people's state was as much an absurdity and as much a departure from socialism as the free people's state. Engels tried to put the struggle of the German Social Democrats against the anarchists on the right lines, to make this struggle correct in principle, to rid it of opportunist prejudices concerning the state. Unfortunately, Engels' letter was pigeonholed for 36 years. We shall see farther on that even after this letter was published, Kautsky persisted in virtually the same mistakes against which Engels had warned. Babel replied to Engels in a letter dated September 21st, 1875, in which he wrote, among other things, that he, quote, fully agreed with Engels' opinion of the draft program, and that he had reproached Liebknecht with readiness to make concessions, but if we take Babel's pamphlet, Our Aims, we find there views on the state that are absolutely wrong. Quote, the state must be transformed from one based on class rule into a people's state, unquote. This was printed in the ninth edition of Babel's pamphlet. It is not surprising that opportunist views on the state, so persistently repeated, were absorbed by the German Social Democrats, especially as Engels' revolutionary interpretations had been safely pigeonholed, and all the conditions of life were such as to wean them from revolution for a long time. Section 2. Criticism of the draft of the Erfurt Program. In analyzing Marxist teachings on the state, the criticism of the draft of the Erfurt Program, sent by Engels to Kautsky on June 29, 1891, and published only 10 years later in Neue Zeit, cannot be ignored, for it is with the opportunist views of the Social Democrats on questions of state organization that this criticism is mainly concerned. We shall note in passing that Engels also makes an exceedingly valuable observation on economic questions, which shows how attentively and thoughtfully he watched the various changes occurring in modern capitalism, and how for this reason he was able to foresee, to a certain extent, the tasks of our present, the imperialist, epoch. Here is that observation, referring to the word planlessness used in the draft program. As characteristic of capitalism, Engels wrote, quote, when we pass from joint stock companies to trusts, which assume control over and monopolize whole industries, it is not only private production that ceases, but also planlessness, unquote. Here we have what is most essential in the theoretical appraisal of the latest stage of capitalism, i.e. imperialism, namely that capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism. The latter must be emphasized because the erroneous bourgeois reformist assertion that monopoly capitalism, or state monopoly capitalism, is no longer capitalism, but can now be called state socialism and so on, is very common. The trusts, of course, never provided, do not now provide, and cannot provide complete planning. But however much they do plan, however much the capitalist magnates calculate in advance the volume of production on a national and even on an international scale, and however much they systematically regulate it, we still remain under capitalism. At its new stage, it is true, but still capitalism without a doubt. The proximity of such capitalism to socialism should serve genuine representatives of the proletariat as an argument proving the proximity, facility, feasibility, and urgency of the socialist revolution, and not at all as an argument for tolerating the repudiation of such a revolution and the efforts to make capitalism look more attractive, something which all reformists are trying to do. But to return to the question of the state, in his letter, Engels makes three particularly valuable suggestions. First, in regard to the Republic. Second, in regard to the connection between the national question and state organization. And third, in regard to local self-government. In regard to the Republic, Engels made this the focal point of this criticism of the draft of the Erfurt Program. And when we recall the importance which the Erfurt Program acquired for all the social democrats of the world, and that it became the model for the whole Second International, we may say without exaggeration that Engels thereby criticizes the opportunism of the whole Second International. Quote, the political demands of the draft, Engels wrote, have one great fault. It lacks, Engels' emphasis, precisely what should have been said, unquote. And later on, he makes it clear that the German constitution is, strictly speaking, a copy of the extremely reactionary constitution of 1850, that the Reichstag is only, as Wilhelm Liebknecht put it, the fig leaf of absolutism, and that to wish, quote, to transform all the instruments of labor into common property, on the basis of a constitution which legalizes the existence of petty states and the federation of petty German states, is a, quote, obvious absurdity. Quote, to touch on that is dangerous, however, Engels added, knowing only too well that it was impossible legally to include in the program the demand for a republic in Germany. But he refused to merely accept this obvious consideration, which satisfied, quote, everybody. He continued, quote, nevertheless, somehow or other, the thing has to be attacked. How necessary this is shown precisely at the present time by opportunism, which is gaining ground in a large section of the Social Democrat press, fearing a renewal of the anti-socialist law, or recalling all manner of over-hasty pronouncements made during the reign of that law. They now want the party to find the present legal order in Germany adequate for putting through all party demands by peaceful means, unquote. Engels particularly stressed the fundamental fact that the German Social Democrats were prompted by fear of a renewal of the anti-socialist law, and explicitly described it as opportunism. He declared that precisely because there was no republic and no freedom in Germany, the dreams of a, quote, peaceful path were perfectly absurd. Engels was careful not to tie his hands. He admitted that in republican or very free countries, quote, one can only conceive, of a peaceful development towards socialism. But in Germany, he repeated, quote, in Germany, where the government is almost omnipotent, and the Reichstag and all other representative bodies have no real power, to advocate such a thing in Germany, where, moreover, there is no need to do so, means removing the fig leaf from absolutism and becoming oneself a screen for its nakedness, unquote. The great majority of the official leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, which pigeonholed this advice, have really proved to be a screen for absolutism. Quote, in the long run, such a policy can only lead one's own party astray. They push general, abstract political questions into the foreground, thereby concealing the immediate, concrete questions, which, at the moment of the first great events, the first political crisis, automatically pose themselves. What can result from this, except that at the decisive moment, the party suddenly proves helpless, and that uncertainty and discord on the most decisive issues reign in it because these issues have never been discussed? Quote, this forgetting of the great, the principal considerations for the momentary interests of the day, this struggling and striving for the success of the moment regardless of later consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for its present, may be honestly meant, but it is and remains opportunism, and honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all. If one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power in the form of the Democratic Republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution has already shown, unquote. Engels realized here in a particularly striking form the fundamental idea which runs through all of Marx's works, namely that the Democratic Republic is the nearest approach to the dictatorship of the proletariat. For such a republic, without in the least abolishing the rule of capital, and therefore the oppression of the masses and the class struggle, inevitably leads to such an extension, development, unfolding, and intensification of this struggle that, as soon as it becomes possible to meet the fundamental interests of the oppressed masses, this possibility is realized inevitably and solely through the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the leadership of those masses by the proletariat. These two are, quote, forgotten words of Marxism for the whole of the Second International, and the fact that they have been forgotten was demonstrated with particular vividness by the history of the Menshevik Party during the first 6 months of the Russian Revolution of 1917. On the subject of a federal republic, In connection with the national composition of the population, Engels wrote, quote, "What should take the place of the present-day Germany, with its reactionary monarchical constitution and its equally reactionary division into petty states, a division which perpetuates all the specific features of Prussianism instead of dissolving them in Germany as a whole? In my view, the proletariat can only use the form of the one and indivisible republic. In the gigantic territory of the United States, a federal republic is still, on the whole, a necessity, although in the eastern states it is already becoming a hindrance. It would be a step forward in Britain, where the two islands are peopled by 4 nations, and in spite of a single parliament, 3 different systems of legislation already exist side by side. In Little Switzerland, it has long been a hindrance, tolerable only because Switzerland is content to be a purely passive member of the European state system. For Germany, federalization on the Swiss model would be an enormous step backwards. 2 points distinguish a union state from a completely unified state. First, that each member state, each canton, has its own civil and criminal, legislative, and judicial system. And second, that alongside a popular chamber, there's also a federal chamber in which each canton, whether large or small, votes as such. In Germany, the union state is the transition to the completely unified state, and the revolution from above of 1866 and 1870 must not be reversed, but supplemented by a movement from below, unquote. Far from being indifferent to the forms of state, Engels, on the contrary, tried to analyze the transitional forms with the utmost thoroughness in order to establish, in accordance with the concrete historical peculiarities of each particular case, from what and to what the given transitional form is passing. Approaching the matter from the standpoint of the proletariat and the proletarian revolution, Engels, like Marx, upheld democratic centralism, the republic, one and indivisible. He regarded the federal republic either as an exception and a hindrance to development, or as a transition from a monarchy to a centralized republic, as a step forward under certain special conditions. And among these special conditions, he puts the national question to the fore. Although mercilessly criticizing the reactionary nature of small states, and the screening of this by the national question in certain concrete cases, Engels, like Marx, never betrayed the slightest desire to brush aside the national question, a desire of which the Dutch and Polish Marxists, who proceed from their perfectly justified opposition to the narrow Philistine nationalism of, quote, their little states, are often guilty. Even in regard to Britain, where geographical conditions, a common language, and the history of many centuries would seem to have put an end to the national question in the various small divisions of the country, even in regard to that country, Engels reckoned with the plain fact that the national question was not yet a thing of the past, and recognized in consequence that the establishment of a federal republic would be a step forward. Of course, there is not the slightest hint here of Engels abandoning the criticism of the shortcomings of a federal republic, or renouncing the most determined advocacy of and struggle for a unified and centralized democratic republic.
So we'll stop there and be back tomorrow at the same time. And we'll continue with the State and Revolution, daily routine of meditation, yoga, and martial arts. Please like, share, and subscribe.